Tell us, if you can, a little bit about how you got the PAL concept broadcast to the computer industry and how it was received. What big problems did you have and how did you get them solved?
So we wrote a handbook,
Right.
that PAL handbook, and that was really fun. Ray Goldsberry, the marketing guy, he hired an artist to help promote the product. And they called in the advertising people and the news agency, and they were going to make a big announcement. And so we designed the cover for the PAL handbook. It had a picture of a big 7400 kind of dual inline package, but it had a lot of little tiny 7400s inside. So the concept was inside of this big chip, you can have all these little chips. That was the main thing.
Good idea, yeah.
And we printed 100,000 of those handbooks. And the handbook was fun because we had the artist, he drew a caricature of a PAL. And PAL was a twist on the industry term was PLA, Programmable Logic Array. We just did a twist.
Was that your idea?
Yeah.
Good.
And it was fun. People liked the name. It was a friendly name. Engineers liked it. Oh,
PAL's your friend.
Sure, PAL's your friend. So that was a good marketing thing. We made a part number system that kind of came from vacuum tubes. 6AU6, what does that mean?
I used it in the TVs, but I don't remember exactly what it did.
6-volt filament.
Oh, yeah.
AU was a pentode. And the last 6 was the number of pins minus 1, so it had 7 pins. So I kind of looked at that number system, and the transistor number system was all screwed up. You couldn't ever decode it. So we came up with this number system, 16L8 or 16R8. 16 was the number of array inputs, 8 was the number of outputs, and L or R meant it was sequential or a combinational. And so the part number system was easy to remember. And you had asked about, well, some parts had 8 registers, some had 6, some had 4. It was the same die. We just metal mask option the different. So we designed all the parts and then put them together to see which ones could share the same die. And we only had 3 die and 15 part types in the family. And we put them in these 20-pin, what I called skinny dip packages, trademarked. And later we did the 24-pin. We invented the 24-pin skinny dip. You wanted these packages to be small, 0.3 inches center to center, compared to the 0.6 inches where the fat dips, which took up a lot of board space. So something as simple as that was very critical to selling these devices. But the PAL handbook was fun because it showed how to design with this. And we would go out into the world, and I must have given 1,000 seminars showing how to design. And then we had to have design tools.
Did you invent the tools yourself or
I
get
did.
partners?
Nope, I wrote the tools myself in Fortran over a Christmas vacation. I later made some additions, but the basic creative work was done over the Christmas vacation because the product was coming out in January, and we needed to have tools ready.
And what would you say the time frame was? Do you remember about the year that was happening?
Yeah, it was about 1976, 77.
Okay.
It was the Christmas of '76 and into the January of '77.
Okay, there you go.
I know that because that's my only time that I was there, and that's what was happening.
Okay.
Well, one of the reasons that I asked the question on the time frame was because I personally hadn't encountered Verilog, which was one of the big languages later, until about the early to mid 1980s. So you're almost 10 years ahead of some of those more industry standards in terms of having a syntax to describe logical function and so forth. So I just thought that was an interesting
That is an
Pretty
interesting topic. Why there were competing languages that came out, Able from Data.io,
Couple, yeah.
and Couple. So there was not a standard, and it kind of got dispersed. I remember we went to JDEC meetings and tried to get everybody to standardize on one syntax. We didn't do it. Couldn't get competitors to standardize, and that really left it open for Verilog. I was always sad that we didn't somehow get together and carry that Boolean language forward, because Verilog was a simulation language. I still am frustrated writing Verilog. That is not that intuitive, and it's very wordy. You get all these lines. Palasm was just simple. You write Boolean equations, and you have a pin list that defines all the variables. One page. And so in this book, the a PAL handbook, on one page you can describe a whole function.
Right.
And all the Boolean is there. And we also had test vectors. Here's test vectors that would check your logic, make sure it was working.
Stimuli and response.
Yeah. So the book really sold it because it was intuitive, easy to understand. And I don't know if this later edition has any pictures, but we have a little PAL man here in the first.
I know he's towards the back of it for sure.
He's in the back. Okay, there he is. So the artist would draw these pictures that would be sort of unique to what the design was.
And it was very clever.
I remember that when we first published the book and the CEO got a chance to look at it, he comes storming down the hall, and what is this? We are not selling cartoons here. He was very upset, Zevdroy, that we had cartoons in our very serious application handbook.
And your cartoons were a hit.
But the cartoons were a hit.
I believe I've seen Pal Man T-shirts.
The engineers loved it. So it was kind of a good marketing. We had a very friendly, good marketing success. And
Did you have to go out and do a lot of seminars or give papers at conferences or what?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think in this book, I remember Vince Coley, he was always capturing the papers, and he would put them in the back. Yeah, here they are. So
Put a list of all the references and stuff.
yeah, he would put these papers that we would give at Westcon or whatever, he'd always put them in the back of the book. So, yeah, we had about 10.
And you look at the thickness of that book, and it's in paperback, and I believe they were all free to the
Oh,
users.
yeah. It started off, it was only a 1/4 inch thick, and then it kept getting fatter and fatter and fatter. Finally, McGraw-Hill published it as a book that you could buy. It was in the bookstores.
How long did it take between having working silicon and having production orders from the customers?
It was very quick. In fact, you may remember we got into trouble with delivery. The demand was instant and very high demand, and we got it designed in at a number of places, including one government facility. It was on a defense contract, and when that contractor didn't get their deliveries, they sent out their own security people who would sit in our building and
The
make
next
sure
one off the line is theirs. Yeah.
that we were going to ship those parts. It was a military need.
Welcome to military law.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, in terms of growth, your growth, I think you were commenting during a break, wasn't it, that you were doubling every year?
Yes, I remember. First year was 10 million, and then 20 million, and then 40 million, and 80 million, and 160 million. I think I started to roll off around 200 or 300 million.
Yeah.
And then the company was.
It was very clear that at one point, MMI held the largest PLD market share. So once you got there, eventually other people recognized that that was a viable market, and you started getting copy people and, you know, second sources and so
Yeah.
forth, and eventually it's going to start giving away. What would you say the forces were?
Well, customers always want multiple sources.
Yes.
And so we actually encouraged some of them. I think National Semiconductor was one of the first that we encouraged and maybe worked with them a little bit. And then other companies came along, AMD, Raytheon, Texas Instruments. There were many sources for the PAL product. And at that time, the total available market was about $1 billion of TTL. And so getting 200 million was a pretty good piece of it.
Oh, yeah.
And then it grew to much larger than that.
Did MMI foresee the explosion in the EPLDs and later into the FPGAs and do anything about it?
No, so MMI had a bipolar process. Their success was in bipolar, and they realized that they would need to go to the CMOS process, and in fact did have a CMOS line startup, and in fact worked with Cypress Semiconductor. MMI was the first foundry for Cypress Semiconductor. And T.J. Rogers was in there at night running the CMOS fab, getting Cypress started. But somehow MMI never got the CMOS formula working. And that was kind of the demise, because the power of bipolar, the power consumption was just too high as the CMOS availability was coming in, and it was obvious to other startups
Right.
such as Xilinx and Altera that, oh, CMOS is the way to go. And MMI didn't make the jump, and I think the management was probably saying, you know, we're not being successful with this CMOS, and it's going to take a lot more investment, and so maybe we better cash in our chips now and merge with AMD, which they did, who did have a CMOS process, and that's the way it went.
And so I know that your next company is going to be QuickLogic. Were you already at QuickLogic when that happened with MMI and AMD, or were you?
So we were very successful with the PALs, and I had become a consultant around before the merger with AMD. And when companies are going to do a merge, I don't know, you just kind of sense something's going on here. The priorities are not going my way.
Right.
And there were other opportunities coming up. People were
Less focused.
offering me lots. There was a company, Actel, who wanted me to help them out. And there were 2 or 3 other companies that wanted me to help them out. I was making programmers for various companies, ICT, and so I just kind of drifted away and worked for a few years as a consultant. And then when MMI was sold, Andy Chan and H.T. Chua, who were the designers of the PALs, they also departed. And we got back together around the kitchen table and thought, well, what could we do next? And I remember 1988 was the year of the dragon, and we had a little dragon symbol. That's how I remember that QuickLogic was founded in 1988, and we had a new vision.
That would be the PASIC.
Yes.
And I think that was a lowercase p with a capital ASIC.
That's correct.
And I'm going to assume it means programmable ASIC.
Yes, our vision was to make a gate array that was was interconnected with fusible metal.
Mm.
But before we go on to Quick Logic, did we cover all the subjects at MMI and PALS and PALASM and customers?
The only other one that I can think of, but I don't know if it's really your background or not, is just the general. I worked at Signetics.
Yes.
And I know that they made both titanium tungsten fuses as well as a Nichrome-based technology, and the yield in that business is not trivial. And getting all the parameters right so that you can electrically program or unprogram, depending on what you're doing, can just really, if you have a bad run of stuff, you may have no yield. And you can also have high yield. I was just wondering if that was...
Oh, that was key.
Yeah.
The switch from Nichrome to titanium tungsten
Yeah.
was very key. The Nichrome had a fusing characteristic of just kind of like splintering. And then there was the bad word grow back. Well, what if one of these splinters would kind of reconnect? Oh, that was really bad. The titanium tungsten had a clean burn. It would melt and...
Yep.
And so it was really good.
Surface tension pulls it right down.
And the part of the bipolar process, there was a titanium layer that was already in the process, and so it was fortuitous to switch from a nichrome layer, which is a resistance, which when you put a high current through it, it would defuse. And same with the titanium tungsten, but the titanium tungsten was a clean disconnect.
Right.
But switching over from one process to another process in a fab is a very critical thing. You're shutting one down and you're bringing another one up, and if you don't get this one up before that one, you turn that one off, you're in big trouble. So there was some delay in bringing on the PAL product due to that very issue.
And at that time, MMI was fabbing here in America?
Oh, totally. Never
Okay,
fabbed
yeah.
anywhere else. We fabbed right there at the corner of Central and Lawrence Expressway. Yep, we built everything there. We had marketing and sales and applications and fab and assembly. No, I think we did send assembly to Penang.
Were you cognizant much about and did you participate at the time of the transition between Zev Jory and Irwin?
I was there,
Yeah.
yes. And it was kind of
How did that go?
quiet, but Zev Jory, he was the founder. He came from, he had experience at IBM and Electronic Arrays and Fairchild, and he was a very strong individual. He was from Israel, and he returned to fight the Six-Day War and was captured and escaped. And so he's a very intense fellow. And so as a CEO of a company, he was quite fiery. And
Mercurial is the term.
but he got the company going, and then turned over the reins to the CFO, Mr. Fetterman, who was a finance person.
Right.
Was it Zev Jory's idea to step down, or was he pushed, or did somebody pull him somewhere else, or what?
His relationship with the board of directors and the ups and downs of sales cycles, I'm sure there was a lot of intense meetings. But Zeb went on to become a VC and become very successful. But he was a very controversial character, but it was exciting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
He drove a 911 Porsche.
Yeah.
Which brings up an interesting subject.
Oh, yeah.
I seem to recall somewhere Now, I was working at a competitor,
Yeah.
and the reason I'm going to mention this is that I understand the person who was the primary chip architect of that competitor had found out that you got a free Porsche
Yes.
as an extra bonus or a reward or something, and he went to his management and also insisted on the same treatment. And I sat there and I thought, that's interesting. That was an aspect of Silicon Valley that was sort of flamboyant, to actually think in terms of automobiles.
Or rewards.
How did that go?
Oh, so that was a great PR event, and it was Erwin Fetterman who thought up the idea of, wow, this was a great product concept, great invention, and let's reward John and HT for the creation of this product. And they had a meeting in Palo Alto, and we all had to go to this meeting. And there were some speeches, and I was drinking and not.
Did you not know this was going to?
No. And Erwin was giving this speech and about, and I remember the words were, you know, the whole company has made this success. It's not just a few individuals. But to not reward the individuals who really did come up with this would be equally wrong. Therefore, we are awarding John and HT these with a gift. And then the music started playing, and the lights went down, and the stage opened. And there were two new cars on the stage, a Porsche and a Mercedes. And they had the license plates, PAL JB and PAL HT were on these cars. What a great
Oh,
what
that
a
got
great
more
day.
PR than any event except possibly Operation Crush.
It did get a lot of PR, newspaper articles.
I had heard that you were actually a photograph of that scene with you and HT and the two cars or something was in National Geographic.
It was. So when National Geographic did their
Silicon Valley.
Silicon
issue.
Valley
In
articles,
the
yep, they came out and they took
mid to late
pictures.
70s, 78 I think it was.
Yeah.
Whatever.
So it was a glorious success. We didn't mention some of the early successes with the Data General computer,
Oh, yeah.
the MB8000.
Big designs.
How'd you get those designs?
Those companies, we had a good salesman out there in Boston, and the salesman would go around and he would take me and I'd give a seminar, and the designers of the MB8000 there at Data General, they were just coming up with this new architecture. They said, that is a perfect product. And so we started shipping them. At the time, they were $5 parts. They were expensive. And I remember they had a lot of octal buffers, octal registers, and sometimes they would like a different flavor of an octal register. Some outputs complemented, some not. Well, it turns out you could just plug a PAL into that octal register slot and change the function a little bit, but you would raise the price from 25 cents to $5. And the engineers were doing that. We called them PAL addicts. And at the time, the design of that computer, there was an editor who wrote a book called The Soul of a New Machine, Tracy Kidder. He went and lived with these computer architects and chronicled the design of a new computer. And it was a very successful book. And of course, he talked about PALs and
Maybe the book may be more successful than the computer.
It probably was. I remember going to the National Computer Conference and seeing the Data General unveil that new computer, and we open up the doors and looking in and see there's lots of PALs. So the engineers, the PAL addicts, they would just throw these PALs everywhere. They had apparently no concept of cost, and it was great.
Maybe they thought if they got the volume up, the price would come down eventually.
Now, the addiction was that they could design their own
What they
chip.
wanted to do.
That's right.
They could customize this to their own. And then they could type Boolean equations and program the devices.
Yeah.
And so I remember giving a seminar at Apple in the early days. Actually, it was with my wife, and for some reason we both wore white suits. I don't know. I wore a white suit. She wore a white suit. So we were giving this seminar. She was not my wife at the time. We gave the seminar, and Steve Wozniak was in the audience there, and also Burl Smith, who was a key designer of this new Macintosh. And we gave the seminar, and they said, "Oh, this is really cool," and I think we could use this. But at the same time, they were committing to a gate array, and they had this new factory in Fremont. They're all ready to go build all these Macintoshes, and the gate array was not working.
Oh.
They called us up. And in fact, Burl Smith would drive in his car over to MMI. He would come through the front door. He would go upstairs to my office and say, "I need more pals." I'd open my desk drawer and here's some more pals. Yeah, we got to know Burl Smith pretty well. And then time came to be testing. Steve Jobs was trying to get the price down. These are too expensive, too expensive. And it was, well, we could do it if they weren't programmable. We'd make a hard version, like a mask version. Call it HAL. You give us a big order, we'll make a mask version. Okay, but now we have to test it. And part of the control logic for this memory in the Macintosh computer was doing a state machine, but it didn't have a reset. There was not enough pins for a reset pin. So it just came up and started working. But, okay, that's fine for the Macintosh, but it's not fine for the tester. You turn it on, the tester wants to know, where are you? Okay, you give it a clock, but the state machine is lost. And so there was a great controversy over how do you test this chip? And Burl Smith would say, Larry Hauska, the test engineer, he would say, well, you need to have an initial condition. You need a reset. I don't have enough pins. And then Burl would say, you are building this chip. It's your responsibility to test it. So we figured it out. We did an exhaustive analysis of what we could push and poke on the pins of this chip to get it to some initial condition, and then we would run the state vectors, the test vectors.
Interesting.
And then there was the Ms. Pac-Man by General Computer. It used 4 PALs, the big 24-pin skinny dip version of PALs to control the state machine and the video to make the little Pac-Man run around. And the great story there my wife always tells is that this was a highly secure design. Games were very competitive, and you didn't want people to. And we had a thing called the last fuse. We always put the last fuse on the device. That would mean you couldn't read the design out. So General Computer, they were very worried that somebody would get this game and copy it. But we had a feature, the last fuse, which I put in there on purpose. And the reason I figured it out is because I was calling on a games manufacturer, talking about these new chips coming. And you ask, did we test it on customers? That was a customer test, and the customer told me, you better make it secure. So we added this last fuse, which defeated the verification of reading out the pattern. And so these PALs were all secured, but then we had the tapes that program the devices. And General Computer was very concerned, where do you keep those tapes? We don't want them stolen. So my wife, then not my wife, kept the tapes in her purse. That was the most secure place.
Interesting.
What was her role in the company?
She was a product planner, where product planning means scheduling the wafers. And you had to have a lot of intuition about lead times, and then you had a lot of variations of different masks and different packages. And you had to kind of have a feel for, well, which ones are going to come in next month, and I better have inventory. So that was her task, and she was very good at it. So we had little badges. I was known as the father of the PAL, and she had a badge that said the mother of the PAL.
You were already married before you were married.
And then we got married.
Or at least you had your own children before you were married.
That's fun.
Yeah.
So,
All right, well, let's go back now to as you decided your PAL is very successful, you became a consultant. How come?
I was just a kid in a candy store with attention, so much attention. I started making PAL programmers, kind of on the side, but what could MMI do? I mean, they needed programmers, and I was competing with their supplier, Data.io, which is kind of a awkward situation. So I was driving this Porsche around, and I was helping, and the reps and distributors, they liked my programmer, and so I was competing a little bit with our supplier. So it was a little bit of an awkward situation. But then at the same time, the company was getting positioned to be sold, and I was becoming more independent, and then Actel offered me a consulting position and big bucks. And, and then there were 2 other companies that were offering me. And so I was able to command a lot of consulting dollars, just being independent, and so I went off. And soon after that, the company was sold. So everyone was wondering, how did you know? So I just felt it somehow.
psychic.
Actually, the company was not being able to make the bridge to CMOS. And so they were trying to focus on other things, gate arrays. And I was wondering, why are you building gate arrays? I mean, you have programmable logic. You're doubling every year. Why are you defocusing? And you had asked a question about the MegaPAL. That MegaPAL was the attempt to get higher density, but the bipolar process was just too power hungry. It didn't make sense. We made the product. We made the big splash, the big PR push. And then Burl Smith came back. One of the things that we did was we took the MegaPAL, we took the Macintosh, and we pulled out the 6 PALs that were in there, and we put them all into one MegaPAL, put the pattern in one MegaPAL, and replaced those 6 little PALs with one big MegaPAL. But then the designer, Burl Smith, came back. We showed it to him. Oh, look, higher density. And he said, too much power.
Really?
Yeah. It didn't fit.
So my recollection was that the smaller PALs typically drew around 200 mils.
Yep.
And then the larger ones were like 220 or 240 or something like that. And by the standards of the day, that was just fine. But the world was shifting at that point in time and needing to have lower power and more manageable heat and so forth. Yeah. So it was interesting.
So we had a big run, and then it was off to what's next.
So then the kitchen table event started up QuickLogic.
Yes.
How'd that get going? Were you guys already wealthy enough to fund a company, or did you have
Nope.
to go find VCs or what?
We went and found VCs. We went industrial funding as much as we could. We developed a process. So the inspiration was, let's build CMOS logic, like Altera and Xilinx. And HT had, in the back of his mind, he had known how to make a link out of aluminum layers shorting together. And the way he discovered this was, it was a problem at one of the companies he previously worked at, that when they made 2-layer metal, it would short together, undesirably shorting together. And so that clicked in him. What if I could make the metal short together on purpose?
Was it just due to the oxide being too thin or too irregular? Or?
Yeah.
So what, it grew an antifuse or something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we purposefully made a place where the 2 wires could cross, and we developed a thing called Doug Soup. It was named after Doug, the process guy from Fairchild. Put the Doug Soup in here, and when the voltage got to a certain 7 volts, it would connect. So it was antifuse as opposed to fuse.
Right.
All the bipolar stuff was,
Right.
everything was linked, and then you would blow the fuses, which means, so most of the fuses had to be blown, like 90% had to be blown. But if you reverse it and do a connect, only 10% have to connect. So it's an easier yield kind of problem. Okay.
Also, antifuses were reversible, weren't they?
Some of them were, and there were a lot of papers given on that, but we didn't do it.
Yeah.
We just made them connect.
Yeah.
So, one wire over the other wire, higher voltage, connect. But with a gate array, we had to think of a special kind of routing. You couldn't just program it arbitrarily. You would have to start in the center and kind of work your way out because it was routing centric or dependent, routing dependent.
Right.
So
you
we
started
did-
on the outside, you wouldn't be able to do the ones on the inside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we came up with a cell architecture. With our background and experience, we had a wide fan in. It had like 20 inputs. There's a number of AND gates. And we sat around the kitchen table and drew lots of Boolean equations.
Right.
And came up with a logic cell that would implement popular known logic functions to do encoders and decoders and counters. We made sure this thing really counted well. It counted over 100 megahertz, which was
At the
a good
time.
thing in the
Yeah.
day. And so we came to the architecture, and we worked with a consultant, Doug. Why can't I remember his last name? He's a famous Fairchild process guy. And they had a little company. They were making portable fabs. And they developed this process for us. We needed a place to try it out. And so we did work with industrial funders. At this time, we were working on our own.
Right.
I had a lot of contracting things going on, so I had some good income. And we got a foundry, actually is in AMD, to run some first test wafers to check the fusing process. And we were going to look for industrial funding. It was from AMD, but there was an economic cycle of stuff happening, so we went to VCs. And by that time, Erwin Fetterman, whom we knew well from MMI, was a VC. And he said, well, if you can find some other people interested, I may invest. And so then we went to Sequoia and another VC, and we told each one that if you invest, these other two guys are in. So we went back to Erwin and said, well, these other two guys, they say we're in if you're in. And so, boom, they put in the money. And that was a time when VCs were really investing in semiconductors. You know, semiconductor companies were just selling this Silicon Valley.
Right.
If you have some kind of track record, getting money, easy.
Yeah.
So
Did you have to give away a lot of the company?
there was a fellow who wrote a book, John Nichrome. He chronicalized all the VCs startups at this time with spreadsheets, first round, second round, third round, fourth round. And so we read his book. We talked with him about the strategy of, well, you know, how do you evaluate the worth of your company and stock? And his conclusion was, no matter how you do it, whether you hold on to 51% the first round or 70% the first round, by the time you get to the third round, you only get 20%. No matter how you play it.
Right.
And so that's what we did. We kind of played by the VC handbook.
Yeah.
And so we did 2 or 3 rounds of financing. I think we raised some $20 million and got the company going and sold many ASIC devices, programmable ASICs. Our
Okay.
vision was to make an ASIC
Right.
that was programmable. And at the time, performance was really critical. Xilinx and Altera, they had these new CMOS FPGAs, but the early CMOS was slow. And so their performance was not very good. So we named our company Quick Logic because we were fast.
Yeah.
We had a CMOS process. We had a good, fast CMOS process. And we were connecting metal to metal. We were not doing this multiplexers and Cascades. We had a solid logic cell with a flip-flop inside and a carry chain, and we had rows and columns of wires, segmented wires, and we could connect the wires with real vias. So the routing pattern was solid metal, just like a gate array. And we were fast.
Very cool.
And we rose to $50 million in sales, and we did an IPO in 2001, and the stock market crashed.
Yeah.
But we made a little money, and got to live in Woodside.
One of the other aspects of QuickLogic was that you were a fabless. In other words, you didn't have your own fab, correct?
Correct.
And so you had to learn how to coordinate with other people and figure out. You talked about doing your early runs, developing the V-Link with AMD. Who did you end up going with after that?
Well, of course, the mantra of the day was real men had fabs.
Yes, I remember that.
But none of the PLD companies did.
The first one did, MMI.
Well,
We made everything in the basement.
none of the CMOS PLD companies.
Correct. So where did they get that idea? You don't need a fab. Xilinx, Altera, they invented the fabless concept, and everyone was kind of critical of that. But it made sense. And you could get money easier because you didn't have to build a fab that cost $1 billion. So yeah, fabless, that was a very critical step going forward.
It seemed to me that the other side of the coin was Tsmc, which was a company that was sort of in Taiwan, was founded on, we're not going to particularly make any product that's mainstream.
They're going to be a foundry.
We're just going to be a foundry for a whole bunch of players.
Yeah.
And I sat there and I thought, this seems like a clever idea. Let's amortize the risk.
Yeah.
And that seemed to resonate with other chip companies that have great ideas and want to get them out there, but you can't raise $1 billion for your own fab,
Yeah, well, people have compared the analogy here with the automobile industry. Initially in Detroit, there were hundreds of engine companies. And then Ford came along and said he's going to go vertical, and he got the iron ore from the boat, and he smelted the iron, and he made his own engines, and so it went vertical. But then after that, it split out again, and foundries became. So there's a trade-off there, and so fabless now is, of course, is the way, and Silicon Valley has outsourced almost everything to companies in Taiwan,
Right.
except a few companies like Intel.
So after the stock market crash back in the 2001 timeframe, you found yourself back outside of QuickLogic.
Yeah.
And were you consulting in between? I know that at the next point where I met you again was at Xilinx. Were you consulting or just taking a great vacation? Or
I was taking a great vacation.
Yeah.
For a few years, and one day I got a call from Kabelshanker saying, "Hey, why don't you come in and help me out in my product planning department?" in Xilinx. And in Xilinx, there were two major product lines, the Vertex and the Spartan. So the Spartan was the low-cost consumer commercial product, and so I said, why not? And so went back to work at Xilinx and worked on the Spartan 3 and 3A devices and the derivatives of the Spartan 3 family. And one of the things there I promoted was a non-volatile device. FPGAs, for the most part, volatile. They have SRAM. They're SRAM based, and you have to load them up. You have to configure them when you turn the power on. But there was always some market, Actel, QuickLogic. They were non-volatile. You turn the power on and they work. And some applications, it's very important that logic works when you turn it on, if you need it in a hurry. So there is that market segment. And so my idea was let's take an SRAM-based volatile FPGA and stack a flash PROM on top. And so the next generation Spartan, we made sure that there was a place that you could stack a flash on top, and the wires would just bond nice.
You're talking about physically a different chip?
Yep.
Yeah. So we took the standard product FPGA, which was selling in high volume, and just put a little flash chip on top and wire bond it down. So chip to chip bonding, and package that. So you got a non-volatile FPGA.
And as I recall, it not only has the ability to come right up, still has to configure, but it has everything is more quickly because it can be done more in parallel and so forth. But you could also hold multiple patterns because you could get greater density of the. You could
those little flashes, they megabytes.
Yep.
And the FPGAs don't typically require that many bits.
Anyway, so you were doing that for a while, and then I know that Koppel departed Xilinx, and he had been looking at some low power things as well, and you ended up departing Xilinx as well, I think somewhat later than he was. I don't recall.
So I came on to Xilinx. He gave me a title of Distinguished Engineer. That was cool. And I got to...
What was better, being distinguished engineer or father?
Father was fun. But distinguished, that was interesting. That was an interesting title. Yeah, I like that. Xilinx was an interesting company. I remember they would have meetings from time to time and bring in speakers. And I'm trying to remember the name of that speaker that came in, and I lost it. But it was a good company, and but Koppel went off. The VCs had. He was very successful at Xilinx as a manager, raising the Spartan to a very high volume, 300 million sales, whatever. And he was pursued by the VCs to help out in one of their new companies. At that company, they decided to split off and form a new FPGA company. The company he went to, I can't remember the name, but they were making non-volatile memories for ASICs, and they thought that technology would be good for FPGA, and so that's why they pursued Koppel, and then they split that off to form Silicon Blue, and Koppel called me up again.
And Silicon Blue, as I observed, was it had a lot of people who are veterans of the PLD industry in it. Yourself and Koppel, Andy Chan was in it.
Yes, we never did talk about Andy Chan at
Andy Chan, sorry.
at MMI, along with H.T. Chua, were the circuit designers.
Right.
And as H.T. Chua moved up to be the vice president at MMI of Engineering, Andy was the creative worker force behind making the new chips, and he had the CMOS technology understood, and was really a great designer, and his chips always worked the first time, and so he had that reputation.
That's hard to beat, you know?
Yeah, hard to beat. It always worked. He was very conservative, but also innovative, and his chips always worked, which of course in Silicon Valley is a very important attribute and reputation to have.
Oh yes, very important.
Yes, so Andy Chan came along to be the vice president of engineering, and I came along for applications and marketing, and we raised the money to build a non-volatile FPGA using this new anti-fuse technology.
It wasn't just non-volatile, it was very low power.
And extremely low power, yes.
Yeah. Which a lot of people aren't aware that, you know, when you think of FPGAs and you think of the cell phone world, the Xilinxes and Alteras are present, but they're not in the handsets. They're in the routing stations, or what do you want to call them, the cell towers and so forth. In the handsets, they can't afford the kind of power that type of FPGA has. So here was an FPGA that had all the flexibility and the capability of the programmable architecture, but the low power that would allow it to exist in a broad spectrum of consumer-type products.
So FPGAs that are volatile, as we just discussed, they have to be loaded before they work. So it's natural to think of putting the memory on board, but if you would put a flash process or EEPROM on board, that's a very different process. So logic is optimized for one process, memory is optimized for another process. To mix them together, you get the worst.
The worst of both worlds.
Of both worlds. You get high cost, power, bad performance. So it just didn't really fit. So the vision of Silicon Blue was to have a low power FPGA with a memory process that was low power and was compatible process-wise. So this non-volatile process was for gate arrays. It was compatible with TSMC CMOS without any additional mask or process steps. So you take the memory process and the logic process are the same, and you have low power. So it's the best of all the worlds. And we pursued the low power, low cost, small FPGA market, which we really pioneered since it didn't exist. Companies like Samsung and LG and Apple making smartphones would never think of using an FPGA. But of course, they had the similar kind of problems. You hook together disparate chips, and they need to talk to each other. You very often run into incompatibilities, which some logic, programmable logic, would be very good, but it needs to be really low cost. It needs to have zero power. It needs to have good performance, and it needs to be small. So cell phones don't have a lot of room to.
No.
So the FPGA was really designed for this market, and we trademarked it as a mobile FPGA.
Was it well received?
It was well received. It was kind of a different market. It was mostly Asian cell phone manufacturers. We did get some orders in the U.S. I remember the headsets in a General Motors car. You had an infrared transmitter, and the headset needed to be low power. But the cell phones really did need a low power, and they needed a low cost, and they needed the small form factor.
Yes.
And now the cell phones are the features are pretty well known, and they're well established, and they're high volume, and chips are really made to work together, Qualcomm, whatever. So there's less of a need for ancillary logic. But back in the last decade, as smartphones were finding their way, the programmable logic really found some applications. And Denny Steele was really a pioneer of that. I remember him saying in the early days of cell phones, why would you ever want a camera on your cell phone? But to get that camera on there, you needed some programmable logic. So that was one of his early designs, and that was using CPLD, not FPGA architecture. And Nokia, and while I was at Xilinx, they were really looking for it. We need some programmable logic for our cell phones. Yeah. But it needs to be low power, it needs to be low cost, it needs to be small size.
I remember Denny Steele, whom you mentioned earlier, when he was at Xilinx. He was one of the marketing managers for the Cool Runner CPLDs, which were low power.
The Cool Runner, yes, that was a great marketing name.
They were very small. The small parts were also small form factor, like 32 microcell or macrocells or 64 macrocells in a tiny package. Yeah. And one day he was whooping and hollering that we just got a cell phone design win. And I said, how did we do it? And he said, we snuck in the camera port. And I said, what do you mean? He said, they realized they had to add a camera chip on, and they didn't have any interface for it, and they basically used one of our CPLDs to do it at the time. And I realized that this low-power portable mobile market's going to have some different criteria for getting wins and stuff. And so it's an interesting beast.
Yes, and when I interviewed Denny Steele to come to Silicon Blue, I told him what we were doing, and he said, I want to be here. And he came to work the next day.
I believe it. I believe it.
All right, we're getting close to the end of our time here, and I want to make sure we have time to open up a couple of more general questions here than just your arc of your career, which has been quite fascinating. A question we like to ask is, what was of all the things you've been working on that you told us about here, what was the most satisfying and enjoyable part of it?
Certainly the PALs were the funnest and most successful, and really set the course for my career. I was at the right place at the right time. Coming to MMI, as you remarked, here was this band of physicists and chemists. They didn't have a clue to the marketplace that they were serving, and I was fresh from the other side, knowing exactly what they needed, and it was the perfect fit.
So you were the right guy at
I
the
was
right
the
time,
right
the right
guy,
place.
the right place at the right time. And Clive Guest, he really knew that I was the right guy. He just said, "Go do it."
So in line with that same thing, as we were coming back from lunch before this interview, I had said I was going to ask you another question that you might not be ready for, but I would like to say you probably have one of the longest careers in programmable logic, so you have a perspective that very few other people are going to have. Where do you think it's all headed? That's a very broad question, but
I haven't thought about this question, but I have a few ideas. I remember thinking that as processors developed at Intel and programmable logic developed in the PLD world, that they were going to come together at some point. And the question would be, would the programmable logic guys put processors in their programmable logic, or would the processor guys put programmable logic in their processors? And of course, we've just seen Intel purchasing Altera, and so that's kind of where that's going. So now Xilinx is the last big guy, and of course they have a lot of processors on board. So when a company like Xilinx with their $2 billion revenue is looking where are they going to go, certainly adding on hard functions to the programmable logic in markets where this is a useful thing to do is the way it's going. But beyond that, I don't have any particular ideas except find a market need and fill it.
Yep.
Yeah.
A classic statement if there ever was one.
So that's going to lead right to the next question I wanted to ask. What advice would you offer for young folks coming out of technical education who want to have a similarly productive career? Find a need and
lots
fill
of
it,
ideas. So the first idea is believe in yourself. Build your own self-confidence, and then, as Daniel Boone would say, be sure you're right, and then go ahead. So believe in yourself. There's so much opportunity right now. I think back when I came to Silicon Valley, I had notebooks and describing how could I take this naked mini architecture and make my own computer in the garage, and then of course I got wound up working on PALs, and I abandoned that idea. But of course Steve Wozniak was doing the same thing at the time, and he was putting a 6502 in there. Why didn't I do that? What if you have an idea and you have to build a semiconductor company? You need a foundry to do this. There's lots of new things that you can do today. You don't need millions of dollars. You just need your mind. Yeah. And with the internet and with tools, apps. I often wish that I would be developing apps. So anybody coming out of high school or college, they can just go onto the web and type in Google and learn how to develop Android software, write your own apps. You can do this all yourself. You don't need somebody telling you what to do. You don't have to go to work for somebody else. My nephew, he recently graduated from college, and one of his final courses was to make a business plan and kind of like start a company. What would you do? And in his senior year, he started a company, and he got funding, and he's never had a job in his life now, because he just took his ideas and started. So. It's not for everybody to be an entrepreneur, and it's a good idea to go to work for a big company where you can learn a trade, but follow your passion, and a great place now to follow your passion is with designing apps. I remember on my cell phone when I downloaded the app that as a ruler. And a level, and you could take your phone and put it on the table, and it would have a level inside, and so you could tip it, and that's not level, that's not level, or it's something as simple as, well, I need a ruler. Centimeters are inches. It's in the cell phone. Somebody just wrote that app. What great innovation! it takes skill. You have to know how to use the tools. But if you have passion, you can learn. I'm not saying don't go to college. It's a good idea to get your degree.
Sure.
But there is just so much opportunity if you believe in yourself and you follow your passion.
Interesting.
Thank
Well, that's
you.
a very good note on which to end, I believe.
Thank you so much, Sean.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
This has been a lot of fun.